Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ed. We've got about 15 minutes together this morning to permeate your intellectual membrane. Was that the language you used? I love that. It's so visual. Look, we've got a lot of ground to cover in a very short space of time. But before we kick off today, and it's my honour to be the first speaker at this event, just a quick show of hands. How many of you have ever sat through a boring or irrelevant presentation before? Hands up if you've experienced that. Like, unanimous. Okay, here's the second question. How many of you have ever delivered a boring or irrelevant presentation yourself? Hands up. Okay, the honest ones. Look, my commitment to you is this 15 minutes will be neither of those two things, boring nor irrelevant. In fact, I want to ensure that what we cover in this opening session is going to be stuff that is going to be honest. I want it to be practical. In fact, we may even go into the area of being a bit politically incorrect. Is that okay? Because we very rarely get a chance to do that. And yet I think it's vital we speak honestly to the issues many of us face every single day. But I want to make sure we have some fun together this morning as well. So we're going to start off with a bit of a word association exercise. So in a few moments, can I get you to turn to your neighbour and share with them the first word that comes to mind when you hear the term, the label, the phrase, Generation Y. When you hear that term, what's the first word that comes to mind? Share that with the person next to you. Go for it. All right. Now, it'd be interesting to get a sense of what some of the words that just came up in your conversations were, but just to get a bit of a straw poll, how many of you, if you think really honestly, just shared a word that was positive? Who shared a positive word just then? Like 10 of you. Awesome. How many of you shared a negative word? All right, far more. How many of you hate audience interaction and didn't say anything to the person next to you? You're unlikely to raise your hand, I guess. But this is the thing. We hear a lot of negative stuff about this group, don't we? And it's not just Generation Y, who currently are aged 16 through to 34. It's the group under them called Generation Z. And there's a group that you may not have heard of yet called Generation Alpha. They're aged 5 and younger. And we hear about the youth of today, and most of what we hear is scathing, isn't it? It's negative, it is critical. And the interesting thing is, this is not new. In fact, I came across, I guess, an observation about young people recently, which I think encapsulates how a lot of people feel about this young generation. And this was the observation here. It's that the youth of today love luxury. That sense of them being pampered, being given too much. They've got bad manners and contempt for authority. They no longer rise when their elders enter the room. Okay, they contradict their parents and they tyrannize their teachers. Now, this is not from a current affair last week. Okay, this observation was attributed by Plato to Socrates in 410 BC. Okay, there is a sense in which slagging off young people is not new. We've been doing it for millennia. But here's the reality: the generation gap today is far wider than it's ever been before. Would you agree with that? And the reason for that is because the pace of change is so great that the gap between generations is getting greater every single year, certainly every single decade. And just to give you a bit of my backstory, my interest in the whole theme of the generation gap started back in 2004 when we saw headlines like these flash across newspapers around the Western world. Remember Corey Worthington and all his mates and that party they had down in Melbourne? And this was the year that we sort of woke up to the fact that there was a new generation coming through who seemed really different. They seemed to be presumptuous, entitled, disrespectful, disloyal, lazy, intellectually shallow. These are the things that we were told in the media every single day. And I'm actually a member of Gen Y just. I'm 33, not 22. That was very kind. 33, so I'm sort of on the border. And I remember thinking back in 2004, reading coverage like this, thinking, is this true? Are my peers and I really as bad as everyone's saying? Or is this a whole lot of media hype? And so I embarked on a research project back in 2004 designed to look at, what's actually happening in youth culture beyond all the hype. And I spent the next 3.5 years traipsing around the country, working in schools and TAFE colleges. I'm a great believer in TAFE, hence I'm thrilled to be here today. Speaking to young people, researching young people, working with 80,000 of them over 3.5 years. And I wrote a book a few years ago called The New Rules of Engagement, all about what makes that group tick. And over the last few years, most of my work has been with educators, with employers, with parents who are trying to bridge this gap and work with young people. And the most common question I get asked, particularly in media interviews, is, what makes this group tick? And I'm so hesitant to box people. I mean, we don't fit into categories, do we? And I think this is a great danger. We overgeneralize sometimes. And yet sometimes generalizations have value. And I think if we were to put, this group in a box trying to encapsulate what makes young people tick today, I reckon we can characterize them in 5 sentences or 5 statements. And I want to go through these 5 very quickly here this morning. I wonder which of these resonate with your experience of young people. The first statement is this one here, the statement that everyone's a winner. Can I tell you the most common frustration I hear from employers today around Australia and really across the Western world is the complaint that this young group seems so high maintenance. Like there's often this expectation that, when a young person walks into work in the morning, the expectation is the boss will say, "Oh my goodness, thank you for being here today. We're so grateful that you've arrived." There's this sense of needing to thank and congratulate for everything. And the interesting thing is you can think, what is the deal with that? Because it's very true. In fact, there was a study done 2 years ago asking Gen Ys how often they wanted praise from their boss. Okay, are you ready? 60% of them said once a day would be awesome, if that's cool. 35% of the respondents said 2 to 3 times a day would be even better. And I guess the question is, why is this? Why do they seem so high maintenance? And we've got to understand the era that this generation grew up in. Because as we describe each of these, sentiments this morning about Gen Y, none of them are things they've decided to be. Gen Y are a function of the era that has raised them. And this is a group who have been raised in the era we talk about in retrospect as the era of self-esteem. They've been told their whole lives messages from parents and society and educators like, "You are special. You're magnificent. You're unique. You can do anything you want to do, be anything you want to be." And here's the thing. The old adage is true. We crave what we feed on. And so for a generation who've been fed a steady, constant diet of constant praise and feedback externally, there now is a need to have that constantly. This is what psychologists will call an external locus of control. Now, can I put it to you, this need to be constantly affirmed and validated is actually what drives the use of social media. I don't know if you've ever wondered, why do they feel they need to share, everything on Facebook or Instagram? You get a coffee with an awesome pattern on top, and it's like, take a photo. No, just drink it. No, got to share it. And you think, what the heck is that? Why do they feel they need to share everything? Well, it's not just about sharing. Because if social media was just about sharing, this group would upload a photo, check in somewhere, change their status, and that would be it. That is not it. And any Gen Ys here, I challenge you, I bet you do this. I do this. You upload a photo, check in somewhere, and then you check 12 seconds later, how many likes did I get? How many comments were there? You gauge the value of the experience by how much feedback and affirmation you get. It's almost like you can't just see, if you're a Gen Y, you can't just see a beautiful sunset and go, "That's a beautiful sunset. Got to take a photo." Add a filter, maybe crop it a bit, okay, and then put it up on Instagram to get feedback on it. So we've got a generation who crave the constant affirmation and validation because they've experienced it. What we also see is they don't do superbly with the opposite of affirmation. Have you noticed? Employers here, teachers even, will know this. The first hint of constructive criticism for this group is seen as a personal attack. You speak to teachers who'll say they'll ask their students to do a second draft and the student bursts into tears. "Why do you hate me so much?" Personal attack. And it's interesting, the reason for this is because we've got a generation who've been raised never receiving negative feedback. You think in primary schools of the culture of every runner in the race gets a ribbon. I call this communism on the sports field because that's pretty much what it is. But even in schools, the language we use. I've spoken to teachers. One in particular said in her school, they no longer use the word fail. Fail is off the agenda. The term they now use is the term deferred success because, it's seen as better for self-esteem. And so, these are some of the attitudes that this group have been fed. The second statement that characterises Gen Y is that life was never meant to be hard. This is a key one. Because, of course, for many of you, you were raised being told the opposite. You were told that life was never meant to be easy. And so therefore, if life was never meant to be easy, by deduction, guess what? It's just meant to be a little bit hard. So therefore, when life gets hard, that's life. Suck it up. Build a bridge. Get over it. In fact, use those hardships to build your character, your capacity for persistence, resilience. And you see a generation coming through who have been told by advertisers and pop culture that life is meant to be easy. Not just that it's meant to be fair. Have you noticed that one? It's meant to be convenient. So what happens when life gets hard? What happens when the exam gets failed? The car breaks down. a loved one passes away. I mean, because that's life. Life sometimes sucks. And when life sucks, instead of saying, suck it up, this group will often interpret that in one of two ways. If they've been told life's meant to be easy when life gets hard, first conclusion they draw, well, there must be something wrong with the goal I've set. I must be on the wrong path, because if it was the right path, it'd be easier than this. Here's the formula they've been told. Easy equals right, hard equals wrong. You think about this in a workplace setting, they get a job. They're 3 days, 3 minutes into that new job, and they're like, man, this is so hard. Like, seriously, if this was really the right job for me, really the right career, it'd just be easier than this. You see this in an academic environment. I was actually working with a big TAFE college last year. They were telling me their non-completion rate for them of Cert 2 and Cert 3 courses right now amongst Gen Ys is 68%. Non-completion, because they'll see the Gen Ys enroll in a course, they get to the 3-week mark and go, this is hard, like seriously, I've enrolled in the wrong course. I've made a mistake. And they watch the baby boomers and the Gen Xers get to the same point and go, this is hard, I'm going to have to really knuckle down, apply myself here. Whereas the Gen Ys perceive the hardship so differently. So the first conclusion they draw when life gets hard, there must be something wrong with the goal. Second conclusion they draw, I think, is far more worrying. And it goes like this. If life's meant to be easy and my life isn't right now, well, there must be something wrong with me. And I want to tell you right now, in schools around the country, this is the breeding ground for so many of the mental health issues we're hearing about. You've got a generation who fully believe that life is meant to be awesome all the time, and if it's not, somehow they're not made of the right stuff. How sad is that? And the challenge we face as a society is to get alongside this group and build the capacity for resilience when it may not come naturally because of the way they've been trained to think. All right, the third sentence that characterises Gen Y is the sentence that out of range is out of the question. You know, I reckon you can tell the generation someone comes from very quickly by how addicted they are to their smartphone. In fact, a bit of a case in point. I came across this recently. This is an advertisement for Lord Howe Island. And as I read this advertisement, have a think of which generation this was not written for. It said, does your daily life feel constantly bombarded by messages from electronic mediums? If so, there's a place that you can escape to where your mobile phone may not work. It said, come and discover the digital detox of Lord Howe Island. Now, can you imagine any Gen Y reading that and going, that'd be awesome? I mean, that's a nightmare. Like, what's the point, truly? I mean, the whole idea of going on holidays is you take your selfie stick, take as many photos as possible, upload them online and get a whole lot of likes. I mean, the idea of being off the grid is pointless. And to give you an idea of just how addicted this group are to being in contact, last year I was reading in the Huffington Post, there was a study where Gen Ys were asked about losing their mobile phones. Get this, 40% said they'd rather lose a finger than lose their smartphone. And yet my mum, baby boomer, Lord Howe Island, her ideal holiday destination, like be off the grid. No one can call me or bother me. And yet the difference is, you see this group go on school camp, Gen Zs, primary school kids. They get off the bus and there's no signal bars and you watch them, they start wandering, looking for reception. Like they climb trees. And they hold their phones up because the fear is to be out of range. Okay, number 4, fourth sentence that characterises this group is the sentence of why do we do it that way? And I love the theme of this event, the idea of a light bulb moment, because it goes to the whole theme of innovation. Thinking about doing things differently, new approaches, new paradigms. And this question from Gen Y that they ask so often, I think, goes to the core of the theme of innovation. Because I work with organisations constantly who are having young staff come into teams, into businesses, and this is the question they ask, why do we do it that way? Smart leaders are beginning to realise this question can be a gift, rather than seeing it as a challenge to authority or the status quo. Because Gen Y, of course, are going into workplaces with fresh eyes. They don't know how it's always been done, and that's powerful, because so often we get locked into rigid thinking, don't we? We get a blinkered worldview because of the way it's always been done in the past. I love the saying, and it's so true. When we change the way we look at things, the things we look at change. And Gen Y are a fantastic source of challenging the status quo in some really positive, innovative ways. Good example of the power of this why do we do it that way question. I was reading a few years ago of a case in the military, a whole group of young recruits, Gen Ys, who were doing their basic training. They got to one module in their training where they were being taught how to use artillery guns. And their instructing officer said, okay, when you load a round into the artillery gun, make sure you've got a watch on your wrist. You need to count 8 seconds from when you load the round to when you fire it. 8 seconds, not 7, not 9, it's got to be 8. And he was about to move on to the next point in the lesson, a lesson he'd taught hundreds of times. And one of the Gen Ys did something that isn't really encouraged in a military context, and he raised his hand. And he said, "Sir, what's the deal with that? Why do we wait 8 seconds?" And the officer was sort of thrown back by the question, seemed almost insolent, disrespectful, dismissed the question essentially, moved on with the lesson, but the question actually stuck with him. And a few days later, he was speaking to one of his colleagues, another officer, who was a bit of a military history buff. And he said, one of the guys asked the other day why we wait 8 seconds before we fire the artillery rounds, and I actually didn't know. Do you know? And this colleague of his did some research, and here is what they discovered. The reason for the 8-second rule is that years ago, we used to use horses to haul artillery guns to the front line. The 8 seconds was the time required to move the horses back away from the guns before you fired the thing, so the horses wouldn't get freaked out. Now, we haven't used horses to haul artillery guns for just a couple of decades now, but the rule had stuck. A rule that made no sense, served no purpose, and we just kept doing it because that's the way it's always been done. And it took someone with fresh eyes coming in asking why, for them to have that light bulb moment of going, well, actually, that doesn't matter anymore. It's not a rule that has any purpose. Why do we do it differently? All right, the fifth and final sentence that really characterises this group is one that I think was a light bulb moment for me. My expectation working with young people in schools and TAFE colleges for a number of years is that I think I went into working in that research project with an assumption that young people sort of had it all together. Certainly when it comes to technology, they're very adept, very confident. Sometimes, let's be really honest, you look at young people and that confidence can appear arrogant, like a tough facade. And the light bulb moment for me was this fifth sentence. And it's this sentence that appearances can be deceiving. As I started working with more and more young people and have done so over the last 10 years, I want to tell you behind that confident facade, Generation Y and Gen Z are a generation desperate for leadership. They're looking for mentoring and they're looking for connection with adults. We often hear it said that they are the fatherless generation, and sadly that is true in many cases. If they're not missing fathers, they're just missing parents who are busy, disengaged. And I guess the role of educators, social workers in society, employers, just to be stable adult role models for this group is so, so vital. Don't be put off by what can appear to be confident arrogance. They're looking for leadership. So I hope this has been a useful chance to look at, again, what is making them tick, but also give you some tips on bridging that gap because it's so vital that you do. Thanks so much. Enjoy the rest of the day. Cheers.